Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Architecture and Design talk. Today, we have a special guest with us, Jason Coleman. So, Jason Coleman is an award-winning architect. He has worked throughout England and Germany, and one of his designs has won the Housing Design Award in 2009. His work has also been shortlisted for the REBA Prize in 2011 and 2014. He is a graduate from Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and has taught in universities throughout England, Canada, and the United States of America. He has taught at the Bartlett at UCL, University of East London, Carleton University, and the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Since 2015, Jason has been the student tutor of Design Studio 4 and Design Studio 3 at Oxford Brookes University. And Jason as well was my tutor when I was part of DS4 at Oxford Brookes University. So today we are delighted to have him here today to discuss the topic of why we draw. So without further ado, let's welcome Jason to the talk.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen for everyone. There, hope this is all working. And slideshow. Can I just check? Is that going all fine?
Yeah, that's showing.
Good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's morning here, and today's talk I've called "Why We Draw," and I think it'll be explanatory as we go through. But first, I just want to explain. So my name is Jason Coleman. As Sarah just explained, I'm an architect in London. Originally, actually born here, but grew up in Canada. And I was thinking about this talk, and I realized we're sort of half a world away from each other. Even London, Canada is even further. And I want to start this about where I come from, about what happened sort of before my current life. And I say I come from Canada, from a small village in rural southwestern Ontario. This was our main attraction, an old mill. And it's a place where there were 900 people. I didn't know much about architecture at this point. And this was the village. As you can see, that's a town. This is a picture probably about 10 years before I lived there. I was young. Rural Canada. It's sort of, as you can see, open, some modernist grain silos, lots of sort of 50s housing. And I just want to talk a bit about this photo because I think it becomes relevant later in the talk. So this was the village. This was my life. This is all I knew as a child. And as you can see, it's sort of this in the middle of fields. And at this point in time, people always go to me, you grew up in Canada. That must have been amazing. All the nature of Canada and the sort of vast sort of plains and fields and bears. But the reality is a bit more like this. And although you can see sort of lots of fields around, you can see few woodlots. And I grew up at a time after sort of 70s really, when this is what the landscape looked like. There were few, you could see bits of trees left. They were called woodlots. The farmers, the generation just before us, the grandparents of my friends, they were the people that cleared these fields. It was also a time of DDT and pesticides. So there wasn't actually much nature. I just want to say that because there was a bit of a sort of strange realization when I looked at this picture. Now, as you can see, you go to a local school, you don't know much about the world. And we're talking about drawing. And for me, at this point in my life, drawing was things like this. Drawings could be maps. Drawings were places that recorded where things were. I could always understand maps. I was quite good at reading, but they just located me in the world. But that was one of the types of drawings I could imagine were important for us to understand. The other type of drawing, which I very well understood, was this, instructions. Drawings as how to do things. I was obsessed with building when I was little. And I loved these sort of drawings which told me how to take Lego bricks and assemble them into buildings, or cut up pieces of balsa wood and make sort of airplanes out of them. So this was a second type of drawing, that how I conceptualize the world, how to actually do things, make things. I guess the third type of drawing was this is not a type of drawing from my youth. It's Horst Janssen, an amazing German draftsman. They were drawings which just drew things as you saw them. This is what we sort of, in our meager art classes we had in the village, this is what they taught us drawing was. Drawing was like seeing what's in front of you and recording it. So these were reasons I thought we drew. Now, as a teenager, I had a friend, and in our village there wasn't art, but he lived in the city nearby, curiously London, Ontario. And they had this picture on the wall, which was a drafted drawing. It was remarkable. It was full-size picture of a bicycle in watercolor and lead pencil by a very famous sort of local artist at the time for rural, well, not rural Ontario, but southwestern Ontario, called Greg Kernell. And this fascinated me because I'd never seen this, because I hadn't seen a bicycle like this. It didn't look like a drawing of things that existed. And then a few years later, I went to their house, and their dad had bought a bicycle. And the bicycle looked like this. And this was the first inkling in my mind of what drawing could be. Because I sort of realized that Dad had taken the drawing as what nowadays I would call a design for a bicycle. He'd taken that drawing he saw, and he'd gone off and he got someone to make a bicycle that looked like the drawing. Now, this is probably what you would be familiar with. But I said, this got me interested. And as an 18-year-old, when you're deciding what you want to do, if you live in a rural Canadian town at that time, if you were a woman and you asked them, what should you do with your life, and you're relatively bright, they'd say, be a doctor. If you're male and you're relatively bright and say, what should I do with my life? The teacher would say, be a doctor or be an engineer. That was the sort of extent of imagination of professions. And someone, a friend's father, suggested me, well, you do music, and you sort of said you liked engineering. My dad told me not to do engineering. He said, have you considered architecture? So really quite naively, I applied to go to architecture at school. And I sort of had an imagination. I thought what I'd be doing when I went to architecture school was drawing drawings like this, how to build things, construction of the houses around me. So that one's a little bit blurry on my screen, apologies. And then I thought I'd better know a little bit. So I sort of brushed up before I went to the interviews and I learned some architects. I'd been to London, so I knew Christopher Wren, and I sort of was familiar with him. And my friend's architect dad told me, well, you should know Frank Lloyd Wright. And again, there were drawings that sort of knew perspectives and sections. We learned them in technical drawing at high school. But that was sort of my conceptual world about why people drew. So I went off to architecture school, and it was a marketplace. But what I want to type at this is actually probably a contemporary-ish photo of the architecture school I went to. Every Thursday night they would do lectures. So you land in this architecture school thinking you're going to do construction drawings and perspectives, and you go to lectures. And the place was more vibrant than I thought. I didn't really know much about it. But I think the second Thursday I was there, all the tutors were excited, saying, oh, there's this very, very young woman. She's coming from Britain. She's just won a huge competition in Hong Kong. And it's really exciting. You have to look. So coming from the construction drawings and perspectives, the first drawing I ever saw was this, which I have to say was not what I expected at all. It's not how I saw architecture. And she went through a series of drawings. She had all these paintings. I won't show all, but that's probably one of the most famous ones. And this young woman was Zaha Hadid. And these were her first real drawings that had any fame, and the first time she'd risen to any prominence. So this was quite exciting, a bit confusing, and not what I expected of drawing. So I can't remember, a week or so later, went to another lecture. And this time, this guy was presenting drawings which weren't quite drawings, though they looked like drawings. They were drawings which were actually models. So in this case, an axonometric model, built like a drawing, but made in a model, but built flat. And this is Peter Eisenman. And he had another conceptual, how he was using these drawings, which I'll talk about in a minute. So this went on, we had sort of, next one is Peter Wilson, was presenting these drawings, which were sort of taken apart, and they didn't look like pictures anymore. They were sort of scattered over the page, fragments. And I was first year, probably some of you might be in those positions or have been recently. They were fascinating. I didn't understand them. And I can't remember, maybe 2 months in, someone stood in front of us and presented these as drawings. This is architecture. And this is Daniel Libeskind from, it's not the Chamber Works, I've forgotten the series, he'll come back to me, of drawings. Very early Daniel Libeskind. And what I didn't know when I applied for my little Canadian village was that the school I went to was one of the sort of originator schools of deconstructivism. But I don't really want to talk about that, because what became apparent very quickly is all these people were presenting drawings to us all the time. And they weren't presenting drawings like Frank Lloyd Wright or construction drawings or sections. They were presenting drawings as a way of thinking and about a way of trying to uncover a new architecture. At this point, North America was in the throes of postmodernism, Michael Graves, lots of pediments, lots of colored columns and balls, and very late international style modernism. That's what was built in the towns around me. And these architects, Libeskind, Zaha, Koolhaas, there were many others, all thought this was not going anywhere. And they saw their only way of sort of exploring where we would go is by drawing. And they hadn't built anything, and it would be probably from this point on, I guess about 15 years, maybe 10 years before any of them actually built. But it was interesting because at that point, they had this idea that this would lead to building. And this was actually in the workshop when I arrived in first year of our school. It had been built the year before by ex-students of Libeskind from Cranbrook, where they tried to build his drawings. So although it might look different now with the zigzaggies, originally this is where he thought those drawings were leading. So this was quite thrilling, and they explained it. There was a lot of, whereas modernism at that point, the older tutors hark back to sort of, for us, Corbusian modernism, the sort of grain silos of my village, but the sort of new concrete, the machine for living. These people were looking at another source. They were looking at early Soviet architects, the actual constructivists, Tatlin, Malevich, and they were sort of, these people used drawings as a way of exploring architecture. I have to say, mainly in form, but also with social programs. They thought the drawing would lead to a new architecture, which at that point in whatever 1917, these sort of Soviet, there's no socialist system, thought they needed architecture to represent them, and they couldn't explore that through classical means. And it led to quite extraordinary structures. This is one of those architects, Melnikov. And I just show this because this got me quite excited, because there's these constructivists in Russia. And curiously, when I related very strongly to this, because it looked like my hometown, half the world away, but this method drawing was leading. Now, this is one strand of drawing that was promoted at school. The other one which I was introduced to were the Italians. And they came from quite a different perspective. The Italians at that point were drawing, working more from a narrative perspective, but sort of building atmospheres, stories, metaphysics into their drawings. This is Aldo Rossi, who sort of, at that point, there's one of the most famous sets of drawings in the world were for the cemetery at Modena in northern Italy. And this was probably the most famous, the plan, or maybe the plan, because if you look carefully, that drawing is a plan, it's detailed plans, it's elevations, sometimes it's axonometrics, sometimes it's a shadow diagram, sometimes it's atmospheric perspectives with rendering of the light coming into objects, everything at once. And there was a story being told to us in these drawings. And we were exposed a lot to these. So we went my 4th year to see Aldo Rossi. I was curious how, at that point, the cemetery was being built, had that sort of atmosphere of the drawings. The other person that was looked at, although he was the one, let's say, historic architect, a bit older, was Carlo Scarpa. He was the other Italian that was very much looked at that point in my education, who sort of drew to figure things out. His drawings both told stories, but they told the story of how he figured things out, and those reflected in his architecture. Now, I have to say this was a very good education. It opened me, we learned how to do construction drawings. We learned how to make things happen. We learned how to draw plans, sections, elevations, but we also learned how to think about differently about architecture. And I have to say that served in my life and sort of since in professional life. I'm just going to show you how it works out. You sort of draw technical drawings, one thing, and they become a reality. This is our own work that I work with Robert Dye, the things we've created. I'm not going to dwell on this today because it's not really the subject of the lecture. But you learn to draw these classic things, you hand perspectives, and 2 years down the road, it's a place. It's something that exists. So that's just that's a house. That's one Zark mentioned that won the award in 2009. But I want to change topic now because something happened. Zark will know because we used to take them away. In Britain, we have this tradition of taking people away on unit trips. And during this period in my life, we were taking people to ex-Yugoslavia and different sort of journeys to different parts of it. And one of these trips was to here, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. We'll pick up on this, but just remember this photo. We'll return to it. Because now what I want to do, oh, I've lost my chat bar. I want to share something with you. Where's my chat? Okay. What I'm going to do now, everyone, is I'm going to ask you to look at a video. Okay, I've just put in the chat bar if you guys could get to it. Check that. If I get to the next slide, that's the same link. If you want to type it in, it's probably easier to click on the chat bar. This is a video that is a long-term result or the current result of that trip 7 years ago to Mostar. It's about half an hour long. It's me drawing. It's me drawing something I care about. So what we're going to do, I'm going to leave you. Well, I'm not going to leave. I'll be here in the background for about half an hour. The video is like 20 minutes, 28 minutes long. And we'll return to here once you've watched the video because I want to change course now and talk about why I draw and what I've learned about thinking about why I draw. So this is where we left off. As I said, this is Mostar in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And what it's famous for in the past and again nowadays is this famous bridge over the river Neretva, where the people dive from. Literally, they just jump off the edge. It's quite incredible. But we went there because Mostar it's a city, it was one of the most brutalized cities of the Bosnian, the Yugoslavian wars. It was completely sort of, in a way, obliterated. It started with it being surrounded by the Serbs who shelled the Croats and the Bosniaks. At some point, the Serbs stood back and watched the Croats turn on the Bosniaks, and there was war within the city between the two sides that were defending it. And I had never been to a place like this, a place where you could see how humans could destroy their environment. In this case, in a very short time, not a sort of creeping destruction, but an instant one. And with it came all the problems that you have in such a situation, about things stopped in their track, about internal migrations and the problem of people not living in their homes, about social divides, about pollution and contaminated ground. And what fascinated me about this, I don't know if I should say fascinating, was that the incapacity of architecture to deal with this situation. There were many people that we were working with. We were there with students, sort of in a sort of activist way, where we had students doing installations in the city trying to address this issue with some local non-governmental organizations, artists, architects. But they're all struggling because in this situation, you couldn't draw plans, sections, elevations, and solve the problem. And for architects, this was quite difficult. But for me, another difficulty arose in this city. I was thinking about what I was seeing, something like I'd never seen before. And my teaching partner at the time, he suddenly said to me one day, "Oh, you do remember that I arranged for us to give lectures to everyone." And at this point, there was a group from Sweden, a group from Britain, a group from Bosnia, a group from Sarajevo, from Mostar, sorry. And I said, "You never told me we're doing lectures." He said, "Oh, did I forget to?" And I said, "Yes." And my other teacher partner, she luckily had her PhD on her laptop. He'd prepared something. And I said, "Well, what should I do?" He said, "Oh, just tell them something about what you're thinking about." So that's what I had to do. But I don't know if anyone's tried to do this. I guess you do this every project. You try to find what you're thinking about, which is not an easy task. In this case, made harder that I had what thoughts were in my head and nothing else. So I went out and thought, well, one thing I might be able to do is draw. Well, this is a shopping mall in Mostar. So even finding things to draw was difficult. But that was the main place. It was destroyed. It had never been rebuilt. But I did eventually find some pieces of paper and a few markers and a notebook. And I spent a furious night trying to draw what was in my head, what I was thinking about, what were my real concerns, both at that moment and have been building for the last 5 years. And that was one night. And the next day, in this bombed out music school, I had to draw a lecture. Now, it was interesting as an architect that people came up to me afterwards. A lot of the Swedish group, they were postgraduates who were already teaching. And they came up to me and said, "You know, we've never seen actually someone draw live or try to draw what they're thinking about. We've seen finished drawings, but never someone try to do that." And it made me sort of think, they said, "You should try it again." And that's what happened. So I had to start thinking new. And I had to think a lot about what drawings were. And one thing I realized, or have realized, is drawings are trying to tell stories. One of the reasons we draw is to tell stories. And like all stories, it's through repetition, through doing it again and again. You have to figure out the story you want to tell. And this has happened to me. This was the following year where I tried to tell the story again, this time at the university. It happened the year after this. I think it's the drawing Zara saw me do originally, where I start to take on a different format as such. And someone at this time pointed out to me that the drawings, what they reminded them were cave drawings that cavemen did. And I started to realize why we draw. We've always drawn that way. We've drawn to tell stories. And there's actually research that this I found interesting. I found subsequently that they think language, as in our early language, how we speak to each other in words through our mouths, is linked to the development of drawing. That it wasn't language was fully developed then people started to draw, that they happened at the same time. That was just a sort of observation. So all drawing has always been about storytelling. That's one of the reasons we draw. But as I did this drawing, there were reflections on what I've done, but what I had to go through, and it's about what drawing is and why we draw. Because one thing we do when we draw, we try to see what's there, what's in front of us. And one classic way is to draw literally like those shoes I showed you earlier. Oop. Sorry, I'm going to go to this one. Well, this is Charles René Mackintosh, the famous sort of a Scottish architect, drawing flowers that he saw in front. This is what's in front of you. But I realized what I was trying to draw was something different. Part of the drawing was about drawing this. It was about drawing the earth. And you could do a sketch of that showing Australia. Unfortunately, I think you guys are somewhere hidden in the clouds there above there. You can draw literally that sort of pictorial image you see. But it's a realization to draw. Why we draw is to figure out things, to actually figure out what's there. So there was a long process of sort of trying to figure out how is the earth structured? What are the dynamics? What are the actual literal scientific names for pieces? What are the dynamics of causes place? And you also draw when you're trying to see what's there. This is an early version. The drawing tells you what you don't know. So there's a process between drawing, figuring out, finding out, drawing, finding out again. And that's the process I went through. So that's one of the purposes of drawing. It's about drawing what's in front of you, seeing what's there. Now, another thing why we draw is this, to work it out, to actually figure out what's happening, not sort of what other people have seen or what you can see in front of you, but to sort of figure out what it is. And these I found interesting because I found, since I did that initial drawing, this sort of history of people doing this. This is Richard Feynman. He is actually the inventor of atomic physics, and he was part of the Manhattan Project, unfortunately the atomic bombs that the US developed in the Second World War. But I didn't know this. He was the first physicist that actually started drawing. Before then, physics had been in the realms of numbers and equations. And he was the one that said, actually, there's a way of drawing, and drawing will help us figure out physics and explain physics. And I sort of have been going through the same thing in a very different way, about sort of speculating, redrawing the drawing, figure out the narratives, figuring out what this might mean to me. And it takes a lot of work. It takes drawing and redrawing. And you can see this is maybe a fragment of an earlier version of trying to draw to figure things out, to work things out. And I just wanted to show you, this is yet another person. This is Hilda af Klimt. Now she's what's very important for, because she was also trying to figure out the world, not like Richard Feynman, but in a different way, sort of trying to figure out the narratives, the ideas, by observing that we're controlling things. And although it looks like they're huge paintings or drawings, they're about 5 meters tall. And she gave me this idea of how do I figure out things for myself? And I just want to go through some of the conclusions of that drawing that have been coming. One of the things, when you draw, you start working things out in this way, that I started realizing that a lot of our production as architects is all based, as designers, as makers, is all based upon one simple fact. We need energy. And that energy is contained deep in the earth for most of us at the moment. That's what it's been in my lifetime. It's hopefully changing now, but that's the tradition of 200 years. And what that energy came from was life that had died and been buried. And I came to this conclusion, this is how drawing helps, that actually what we do is we extract the dead from below the earth. And our habit has been to then put the dead above the earth. And with that, we sort of create death in the skies and the atmospheres on the land. So these sort of things arise out of drawing, these sort of working out. Another conclusion was this sort of real. What I read some an Indian author, Amitosh Ghosh, and he called it this thing. He called it sort of illusionary apartness. But how, as humans, we've had this conception for a long time that we are apart from nature, and we cannot imagine that our influence and all our actions. And this is sort of fundamental. I've thought a lot about this in the way we draw architecture, about architectural drawings, because I think you'll agree, architects don't draw life. We draw lines, we draw buildings, we draw substance, but we cannot draw life, and I don't even think we have the language to do that. Another conclusion was how differently life systems work. Whereas they draw from below the earth, they sort of bring that energy to above the earth, that life is sort of energized, it creates sort of further lives, ecosystems, which then feed down below the earth. And now modern sort of ecology realize that what's below us is also alive. There's networks, it's one system, and both systems are based upon giving more life to the world. So that was about sort of working things out. I haven't finished this. It's a constant process, but why we draw to work things out. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is actually all drawing, or not all drawing, but a lot of what we do. It's about drawing the future. When you draw a proposal for a building, you're not drawing something that exists. You're drawing a future. You're drawing something that you hope will exist, or you're positing will exist. And again, I've thought a lot about this because this is actually someone that's very influential for all the people. This was actually more an anthroposophist, a philosopher called Rudolf Steiner, who started drawing live in about 1910. And these drawings are about how the future would look for him. And he influenced another person, which made more relevant, was Joseph Beuys, the German artist in the post-war artist, who again, these drawings, he was constantly trying to draw a better future. And that's what I haven't worked out. I guess I've realized drawing's about trying to draw a future. And if we can't draw life, we're going to have to figure out, just like Zaha and Daniel Libeskind were trying to formally positive new architecture, we're going to have to find ways of drawing that allow us to draw this future that's now a necessity. Let's go flip. That was a version I'll tell you about. That was in lockdown. Another version which I'll give you a link to later. But this is what I want to talk about, the future. Those dates are important. 1940 was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And we're in 2023 down at the bottom. And all those years, we've been burning fossil fuels, bringing things up. We had this energy explosion where everything became possible. The big cross, so near the bottom right, where everything gets big. That's, for me, the end of the Second World War, where the atomic bombs were dropped, which led to something called the Great Acceleration, which is where we were suddenly producing so much energy like never in the history of humankind. And why I want to talk to you, because you're young architects, you're young training people. And at this point in your lives, you're influenced by us as tutors of people gone before you. We've all studied, developed our thoughts in this period, this 250 some odd years, where everything we did was influenced by this abundance of carbon energy. The fact that we can build huge concrete stadiums, huge domes, the sort of forms we look at, it's all been made possible by this. And this has been going on for 250 years or more. So everything that we teach, everything we know has been developed in this scenario. And that's where we stand now. We're 2023. Leading up to 2050, where they say we have to be zero carbon, environmentally sort of sustainable, or temperatures will rise to a level where we won't survive. And you can see it's not much time. And what's interesting for you guys is it's a very exciting time, because that's your professional lives. if you imagine yourselves in 27 years, you guys will be the top of the profession. You're starting something where you're, unfortunately, it wasn't your problem that develops. You're the ones that have to figure it out. There's many people in front of you are trying to, but they're on the journey with you. They're not teaching you what they know. They're just trying to guide all of us to that end point. And I'd say it's a sort of, that's what a drawing's about. It's like a sand clock. Time's running out. But I don't think, as an educator or an artist, and I haven't drawn this, I don't think this is, I wouldn't get sort of depressed about this or pessimistic, because I think the other thing, the reason we draw, is that we draw with hope. I think part of a designer's thing is we are always hoping for a better future, for better conditions, that are the purpose of our drawing, why we draw, is to draw a better future. And that's the end. Thank you. I'll stop sharing. There we go. So.
Thank you, Jason, for that very fruitful discussion about the topic of why we draw. Now we'd like to open the chat box, or we would like to open the floor for anyone who has a question. So anyone from the audience? If there's none, then maybe I could start. So I think that was a very thorough approach of how of why we draw, especially that last quote that you mentioned. We would want to draw with hope for our future. So how do you envision we move forward, Jason, with all the materiality that we use in building modern buildings in 2023? We spoke about using sustainable materials, and how can we bring that further?
Okay. I think this is my own personal view, but it's where it's why I'm not pessimistic, because I think my view is this problem needs to be worked on from so many aspects. And some people would say, oh, you're just putting solar panels on things or green roofs, that doesn't really do the job, which actually probably is the case. But so you've got different ways everyone can work on the project, on the problem. At a small scale, we do as architects, I mean, my practice does smallish houses. We're quite privileged. We do individual houses for people with enough money to do architecture. And at that level, in my own personal life, we do the best we can. We insulate to the highest levels. We try to use the most sustainable materials. Most of the clients will put in heat pumps, they'll put in solar panels. So we work that way. I have colleagues that are in practices where they work more extremely with materials, where they can do research, they can look into supply chains, because they have bigger practices where they can do that. And I have to say I have a lot of time for that too. I think that's all necessary, and I wouldn't criticize any of it. But I think for me, and this won't be for everyone to work on, the other bit is the narrative of what architecture's been about. And it's about creating this larger story. And that's why I personally came on about what is our actual objective. If you think about where I was schooled, and the history was about the architecture, it was very Corbusian. That's the legacy of the modernists. Architecture is the machine for living. And that was very much, the narrative is that you look at how a human being needs to live, and you economically provide for those needs. A living room, dining room, air condition, all these things came out of air conditioning. They need to be cool. but we never were taught what I was taught, and I don't think architecture still conceives what architecture is maybe designing life. We're going to all have to work together in sort of saying, well, I don't believe humans are going to go away. For 1 minute, we will be here for a long time and we're not going to go to some sort of Sylvian sort of past where we live in primitive huts and we all live in that way with nature again. We're going to live in a different way. And we're going to have to figure out a way of telling that story to students, to each other, that our goals change. So I guess that's part of my thing. I think we're going to work on many, many levels. We're going to work at that sort of minute level, making the change as quickly as possible. People can, in this country, insulate better today. They can use better materials. There's a learning process of that. That will come on quickly. But changing the whole, let's say, momentum of the architectural project is something we're going to have to work on as well. Don't know if that's explanatory.
Yeah, yeah. I think I'm getting that based from what you're explaining. Yeah, because even in Jakarta, if I'm not mistaken, I saw this video on YouTube actually about how the land of Jakarta is actually sinking, and people in Indonesia would have to think about how they are going to move forward with um, in dealing with such natural course. And one of the solution that they have done is actually moving the capital city to Borneo in Banjarmasin, if I'm not mistaken. So that was um, one of the solution of uh, the how Indonesia is dealing with such problems. So yeah, it shows how people from different regions would have different ways of coping with natural causes like that.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I,
what would you think about that particular issue?
well, this is something I've been really, because we all go on journeys, and I guess my own journey has been from real life. This started, I live in the UK. It's about sort of our own crises, about so how things were here, and that when I say we need to work in concert, I think we're going to work very differently on this issue collectively, and I think what my current thinking is that the only way here there will not be a solution to the climate crises in terms of the making how people make things in the world. There'll need to be many, many attempts. And that's why I'm tolerant of people just attempting things, because I think some will fail. Some will not work economically. Some will create too much strife between cultures. So things will not necessarily all work. And that's the process. But we need many ideas because they will be both, some will be applicable, we can cross-fertilize. Ideas from, let's say, the Far East will be applicable in South America, in Canada, but other ones will need to be very particular because I've been reading, as I said, this author Amitav Ghosh, who's an Indian author that deals with Sundarbans in Bangladesh. And I've been finding it fascinating because it's an area that's so unlike where anything I've ever experienced. I just have this through his narrative words, but I realized I would not know how to deal with that. It's an unfamiliar landscape. There might be some levels where our way of conceptualizing the world, our way of approaching architecture will be common, but there'll also be very particular ones. But I think the one overarching one for me that I think will be common is this idea that architecture only supports humans, which I think has been one of the main narratives. That is the Corbusian one. It's the machine for living. He never said it's a machine for human living. And as a personal belief, I think architecture is going to need to support the planet and be designed for the planet, which is quite a different idea if you think about our ability to address the client brief. like the client is all, or the stakeholders being maybe the client and the local community. That's what these terms that come into architecture. Who are your stakeholders? So it's your client is the users of the building, the local community, which is great. I'm all for that. I think we have to continue to do that. But it's that horizon that we talk about, this sort of, that's as far as we go. In some ways it's natural, we need horizons, but I think we can do more. I mean, I add in one thing, this is sort of veering it, not really off topic, but one thing I found it incredible, because what I haven't talked about is I also grew up in the time of the conversion from drawing from hand to computer. When I was in university, Apple gave us some of the very early computers. We had a computer suite. That was the first time you didn't actually program drawings, but you could draw. And as I've watched it develop, I've been quite fascinated when you say, what have computers been used for in the act of drawing? For the most part now, they've been used to either economize the supply chain, BIM, and all that sort of stuff, and make the construction industry more efficient, or they've been made to make very fancy form, Zaha Hadid. And I thought about, it's quite curious, because if architects had access to things like the financial industry, there's BlackRock, the hedge fund, they have a computer in the desert in Nevada, somewhere out there in New Mexico, that tries to calculate every financial transaction in the world, and what the outcome will be. If architects had that computer power, where I'm working in my practice and you're working in your practice and someone's working in practice in South America, and we could all sort of know the outcomes, that if I dug in the ground here, I would change, I don't know, the local water table, which would change maybe the way the forests thrive down there, or if you built in certain material in your country, actually it would cause, I don't know, child labor rates in another country to go up, or we'd have access to the information. That's what it's categorically not used for at the moment. We're not connected. And I think that's part of this international thing about the different things. We don't have access to each other's information. We have access to the formal means to do things, but we don't actually have an architecture across fertilization that way. It's probably a lot for your students are up to third year, aren't they?
Yeah, they are up to third year, yeah.
But it's just for interesting for them to think about, what is computing power used for? Our profession, particularly with the way we draw, what those lines come out of.
Right. So yeah, that's something for our students to ponder upon. Also, any questions from the students? Asma, any questions?
Not really. Although I do want to ask Jason, how has the latest AI software such as DALL-E, Mid-Journey,
Yeah.
because you're much older than us, so you've probably started out drawing by hand for architecture firms and to AutoCAD, and you've seen how 3D software is developed. How do you think that affected the creative design process in architecture schools?
Okay, I think it's, I'm not necessarily against it. I'm holding judgment on all of it. But I think there's the curious thing that people aren't talking about in that creative design. And it's something I found personally now drawing like this, and hand drawing, but also drawing here. And there's sort of computer drawing. I do that all the time in the office. It's very much drawing only in your head. So this is maybe a different way of looking. All thought is activated from the brain in that sense. And when I've been doing these live drawings, it's like when I prepared this lecture, I always prepare lectures on my bicycle. Because somehow the movement of cycling through London, being on my bike, my legs turning, allows me to think in a different way. And I know even in the Bauhaus, actually, back in Weimar, Johannes Itten, they worked with this. They had this weird belief, which I sort of subscribe to, that we can't separate brain from body. And that's where I would see AI as a very curious thing, not just AI, but even CAD drawing, is that there's this belief that to draw well comes out of only mental capacity, and that there's not intelligence in the hands or in the legs or in the elbow. And maybe that's why I always enjoyed physical modeling, because a lot of thought for me comes out of sort of drawing in a way that makes mistakes, because I hiccup, the line jiggles, and it makes you realize something. That, and what I find about computers, it's so mathematically prescribed in a way that it doesn't allow your own brain to operate in these other ways. And I think it's that sort of uncanny ability of the brain to see things, patterns, by mistakes, by a breath of fresh air, about warmth of sunshine falling on your skin while you're doing a sketch. That this is as much influencing how we think as little sort of analytical, logical thought. And I guess that's why I'm wondering about AI, is once you, not just AI, but even CAD and even Excel sheets, they sort of remove that capacity to think in those ways. Maybe not where you thought I would go, but that's what I think at the moment. Maybe an exercise with the student. We've done this exercise, live drawing with students, and it's quite fascinating.
Yeah. I remember the one we did at Oxford Botanic Gardens.
Yes.
We did that, didn't we? In the S1?
Yes.
Yeah.
We did these. I think that was the big walk, the Derive walk.
Yeah, exactly.
Where we drew. But it is a different way of experiencing the world, and I'm not against one or the other. But it does make me wonder if we train all our thoughts internalized into the head only, where the task at hand, actually, the big task is about how we sustain life systems. And it seems that we can't do, to me, it seems we can't do that just through sitting somewhere. We have to be involved in those life systems.
Yeah. I would vouch for that as well.
Yeah. We're going to hopefully build with them live in a few weeks.
Yeah. Speaking about that, or maybe we could discuss it after.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
should.
Yeah. Okay. All
Well,
right.
I hope they're very quiet, but maybe they're pondering.
Yeah.
Sometimes I remember lectures also that I saw in architecture school that actually I didn't think about till 3 years after I left, or 5 years after I left. And I thought, it's all something to be in that soup in their minds that brews at the moment.
Yeah. I did my degree and master's in the UK, and I did my PhD in Germany, and I noticed that there's key differences between German architecture schools and UK architecture schools. Is that first year students in Germany, they start using CAD in the first year, but they also have more live build projects. So at the Bauhaus University, every year there are at least 3 installations. So the students have a more hands-on experience building, like timber with, or they work with steel C-sections. Yeah, and then there's more collaborative work too at the Bauhaus, like civil engineering students with the art and design students and architecture students. So I just found that really fascinating, the differences. But the German students, I felt like their work, their presentations, they were less avant-garde, compared to the University of Kent or the UCL students, but they were more practical, and there was like a color scheme or presentation layout that the Bauhaus University drilled into their students, so their presentations look almost the same. But I think they stress more on buildability, but elegant designs.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I went through a bit the same when I was studying, because at that time, Carleton University, there were 3, they called them 3 Cs, They were the very early deconstructivist schools, at least on the East Coast of North America. There were three of them. There was Carleton, Cranbrook, and Detroit, which was a postgraduate, and Cooper Union. And so we traded critics and tutors. They were all moving around. But Canada, I guess, is a little bit a mix. Maybe it's the history. It's sort of the immigrants. There's a mix of German cultures and European culture, and obviously a very strong British tradition as an ex-colony. And I remember what people from the States always thought was weird, because Canadians have that practicality, that you were at this very avant-garde school, and when you sort of drew all these mad things, which were considered completely mad at the time, all the Canadian students, all of us, we actually believed we were going to build them. We'd put in glazing and insulation and stuff. And I remember people coming up from Cooper Union, we thought their drawings were mad. We thought what we're doing, and they go, "You guys are absolutely crazy, because you actually think this is buildable," which is a bit of that. And the other, on the UK, I agree with that, and it's faded. I mean, when I started teaching, and maybe this is continues, curiously think about right now, a belief, I thought architecture needed to be active. And particularly before 9/11, when this was possible, our brief to, at that point, third years was go to this into the city. We just send them out into an area of the city, and we say build something. They built without permission. They would just have to do something. Go to a market and build a stall. Just randomly wrap a lamppost in ribbons. Whatever they did, and that solicited reaction. And and I think they also, because they had to react, you have to be reactive. And I guess maybe that's come back to AI. AI is not reactive thinking. And CAD doesn't tend to be reactive thinking. And we're in a period, as I said, we have 25 years to solve quite maybe the most biggest problem we've had for thousands of years. And there's going to be a lot of quick thinking and reaction. And that's the quick feedback loops. And I think you're right. When you actually make, be it in a workshop or in the city, you have that. You have to adjust quickly. You're planing a piece of wood and a piece chips out. And you have to decide, am I going to just start anew and make it look like the drawing? Or do I go with the flow and I make that corner and I make something out of it? And there's different ways of understanding the world. So there's different intelligence about the sort of how specific design is, how exact design is, how much it can adjust as you try to realize it. And that, I think you're right. There is in the UK now a tendency to just draw. So I think it's got to be in combination where, and I think they realize, if you talk about avant-garde and the Bartlett, and I was thinking about that preparing this lecture, because when I said we don't know how to draw nature or life, and I don't think I know how to draw life, I'm just pausing as something. And when I taught the Bartlett, there's something that we used to call the Bartlett birds. So you get these wild drawings. Zarek probably knows, we probably refer to them.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the student would put some birds in the sky. And I was thinking about that actually cycling in. I think instinctually, everyone's been realizing we can't draw life. They realize the drawing is sort of positing a dead world, even though they might have a program of a stadium or a mass protest, whatever the wild programs were. They realize the drawing inherently didn't have life in it. That's what, it's again a personal thing. That's why the Bartlett birds existed. They knew that somehow something was missing, and I think that's important. Something is missing.
Mm.
Okay, we have a question from the audience.
Is that in the chat?
Yeah.
Okay, it's from Jen. Okay, she says, hello, from what we know, deconstructivism is a building that opposes logical form. But I want to know what are your thoughts on deconstructivism in simple forms? And can you give advice on how the thought process for deconstructivism can work?
Thank you, Jen, for the question.
Yeah, I think, having been at the beginning, I think you're right, and this is when I see students nowadays, and they talk about Libeskind and Zaha and all these people. It became sort of very much a formal conclusion. Deconstructivism. It came about these jagged forms. It's not, as you say, not logical. I think if you really looked at it or knew how Zaha was thinking about things, they are quite logical. There was a process. And I think what's more important is not the formal outcome of deconstructivism. To me, that's uninteresting. There were other deconstructivists that didn't do jagged things. It's really about what they were using. They were saying, we can't work in practice. The drawings that are being used, which I think that's very opposite about Germany, which at the time they drew plans, very rational plans. You have to realize the way of approaching the drawing was controlling the outcome. And I think what was important for me is the thought process for deconstruct. It's about looking at that drawing. It's about using the drawing to explore the world in very particular ways, to play with the world, to explore outcomes. Because the other thing about why we draw, I didn't say it, we draw because drawing is cheap. Compared to building a building, a drawing costs a fraction. You buy a piece of paper or a laptop and you can draw. And it costs an infantile percentage of what a building costs. So we draw to explore ideas. And I think that's where they return to. They got a way to, they start saying, well, there's a way of looking at the world about, I'm trying to think what, they use techniques. They try to disturb the thinking patterns. Maybe that's what's important to say about that. The thought process was about disturbing thinking patterns. So the Libeskind drawings, he was basically tracing, at one point tracing through Piranesi's Prisoner series. He was like extracting layers out of it. Zaha was looking at Kazimir Malevich and his paintings and suprematist painting. And they were more sort of what a provocation to the thinking, to usurp their thinking, because they'd all been trained in this way of plan, section elevation, rational structural grids. That's all, we all came out of those sort of very modernist ideas. So it's not important that they created jagged drawings. It's important that they thought the drawing will help us lead to new ideas. So that would be my answer to that question.
I'd like to continue on that thread, because I remember being part of the S4 when we were sent out in the city of Skopje in Macedonia. We never knew what the outcome of our project was going to be until the last few weeks of the semester. Yeah, so the semester was all about exploring speculative ideas, and then we referred to architects such as Archigram to explore those ideas. And I think that's kind of what Jason meant with the answer just now.
Mm.
So yeah, I hope that answers Jen's question.
Maybe if we're over there, she wants to discuss further. Hopefully we're going to see we get long discussions about that.
Yeah. Okay. I think that sums up today's session. So thank you, Jason, for sharing your insights with us today. Your passion for drawing and its importance in the field of architecture and design has been truly inspiring. So we look forward to having you over in June for the mobility program.
Yeah. Let's keep our fingers crossed. It's all go now.
Okay. So thank you, dear students, for joining the talk. I hope all of you had an amazing time listening to what Jason has to offer. And then we'll open up another screen for you to scan your attendance for this talk.
Good. Well, thank you for the invite. And I wish
Yeah.
everyone luck in the, I guess, the remainder of their year, don't they? They have a couple
Yeah,
months left or something.
yeah, up until July.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Jason.
Okay, and we'll talk soon, Zach. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Asma.
Okay, nice to meet you too. Hope
Okay.
to see you soon.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
All right.
students.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.